All right, so yesterday we covered the election of 1888, and let's pop in now to the presidency of Benjamin Icewater Harrison. So, first of all, here's the old Harrison man in all of his glory. Look at those steely eyes. Oh, that right there. Okay. Harrison had been a minister, and let me pause this for a second. Okay, sorry about that. I had to pause for a brief moment. Harrison had been a minister in his church, and it was his religious beliefs. Now, first of all, just ponder the fact that he's actually an ordained religious leader being elected as president. That probably would not happen today, with given how offended people are by any mention of religion in government. But Harrison came to believe that alcohol was the root of all evil. So yes, he's a teetotaler, and not like Hayes with, my wife's a teetotaler, so I'll go along with her. This is, I'm a teetotaler. I believe this. He had also been a lawyer and a general in the Civil War, which maybe kind of explains his favoring of the pensions, as well as the senator from Indiana. During his presidency, there's a few notable things that he did that we can talk about. The passage of the McKinley Tariff, named after Senator William McKinley of Ohio, the guy who wrote the tariff. Um, this is going to be a recurring, boring theme we're going to have to go through like every time we talk about tariffs from now on. The highest tariff in U.S. history up until this point. Huge tariff, huge protective tariff. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act authorized the government to buy more silver from citizens and then to turn around and mint them and use them as coins. Okay. National Forest Reserves, my personal favorite. Let's set aside forests and lands for future use for people to go and see trees and animals and stuff like that. Increase in military spending. If you're keeping track with these things, this is Presidente Administration number 4 of the, hey, kids, we need to build a bigger Navy. And they're still building it 10 years into it, and now they're spending even more money. Harrison has the first $1 billion budget. This is the first time that the United States as a country spends more than $1 billion in a year. And as a result of the spending, even though they have $1 billion to spend, they spend over that. The deficit, that's the debt, is back up. Harrison fought for civil rights. For all the guff and the shade that I may throw at him, he was genuinely a really responsible, moral guy. Not terribly effective as a leader and kind of a squish, but he did try, and he tried his best. It didn't really work well. The South was still repressing civil rights. And what is really a kind of a quirky mixed blessing, which we'll talk more about in this unit, the annexation, that is the takeover of Hawaii, and the purchase of Samoa. Samoa was split between 3 countries, Germany, Britain, and the United States. All 3 of us were disagreeing on who should get what. We kind of sat down and negotiated that, we'll buy this portion, you get this portion, you guys get that portion. Everybody was happy. Cool. Harrison's Secretary of State, James G. Blaine of the state of Maine, didn't become president, but got to be Secretary of State, second most powerful position in the executive branch. He organized the first Pan American League. That is, the Pan American refers to the Latin word pan is a word that means all or house. It is all the countries in North and South America getting together and just discussing things of interest and sort of mutually beneficial stuff. Now, this is not to say that Harrison's administration was not without its problems. And in fact, it's the problems that outweigh the kind of achievements here. Big problems. So Harrison really kind of upset people within his own party. Many Republicans, pause for a second here again, sorry, back again. Many Republicans realized that Harrison was somewhat of a squish. Now, when I say squish, what I mean is he's really kind of wishy-washy and doesn't really stand for a lot of stuff. This is one of the reasons why, quite frankly, he got nominated. In order to make the people who were in favor of silver, like the former Greenback Party members, happy, Harrison signed the Silver Purchase Act. Now, on the surface, it was fine. The government, people bring in chunks of silver, the government buys it from them and makes it into coins. What's the big deal? Here's the big deal. The US Mint used the exact same minting molds to make silver coins as they did gold. Well, what's the big deal with that? Gold is literally like 100 times more valuable than silver, and yet they made the coins the exact same size, the exact same weight, and the exact same value. So basically, what you were telling Americans is that 1 ounce of silver was the same value as 1 ounce of gold. Well, everybody in their right minds know that that's not the truth. And what ended up happening was is that Americans figured this out real quick. They took all of their silver and they went and exchanged it for gold because it was a straight, even exchange. You had $100 in silver, you went and got $100 worth of gold. Guess what? You just gave them like $10 worth of silver, or like $10 worth of silver, and you got $100 worth of gold. That's not a bad exchange. And the end result is at the end of a couple of years, the US was running short of gold. We talked about this before, and it'll come up again as we go back and revisit this. This also led to massive inflation. Now, this next one that was problematic, really, to be fair, was not Harrison's fault. But it is his fault for what ends up happening indirectly. There was a strike at the Homestead Steel Factory. This was one of Carnegie Steel's different factories. And by this point in time, Carnegie was living in Scotland, writing his, gospel of wealth. He was not involved with the running of his steel company at all. The Homestead plant was run by the unfortunately named Henry Clay Frick. Well, they decided to try to maximize profits by cutting wages and increasing work time. The union wanted nothing to do with this. So there was a strike. Okay. So the Homestead peeps decide they're going to hire Pinkertons. Well, unlike the B&O strike, there was an actual union for Homestead. And they knew that something was coming down the pike. So for months, they had been stockpiling money so that they wouldn't be affected by the strike. They were stockpiling weapons so that they would be ready for the strike. They also scouted out every single way in and out of Homestead, Pennsylvania, and they ambushed the Pinkertons coming in, pinned them down on an island in the middle of the Allegheny River, and they forced them to run away. They then took over and blocked any and all access to the Homestead Steel Factory. The Republican governor contacted Harrison, who basically said, "This is your problem, deal with it." So the governor did by sending in the National Guard. And there was a fight, and the National Guard ended up finally winning because they were more heavily armed and outnumbered the strikers this time, learning a lesson from the Baltimore problem back in the B&O strike. Why this affects Harrison is because Harrison did nothing to intervene, and Harrison basically gave the Republican governor permission to do what he felt was necessary. As a result, people blamed Harrison and the Republican Party for what happened. This pushed labor into the belief that the only people who were going to help them was the newly emerging third party known as the Populists, or the official term, the People's Party. Now, these experiences were so bad for Harrison that he decided he was not going to run for re-election. But not unlike a boy who's going to dump a girl but then gets dumped by the girl first, Harrison discovers the Republicans don't intend on nominating him anyways. Well, then he shows up at the convention and is like, "No, I intend to run. You got to nominate me." And being the president, they're like, "Yeah, I guess we do." The Republicans end up nominating Harrison even though they weren't planning on it. Harrison ends up running even though he wasn't planning on it. The Democrats reluctantly nominate Grover Cleveland. Now, there's no problem with nominating Grover Cleveland again, who had been spending 4 years in a law firm in New York, making a lot of money and living La Vida Loca. He comes right back, gets renominated with no problem. The issue with Grover Cleveland is that there is a growing number of Democrats who are beginning to drift more and more towards the left, and they're not comfortable with Cleveland. To make them happy, they nominate a leftist as vice president, Adlai Stevenson of Illinois, whose kid and grandkid keep coming back too much later. Now, this is weird enough, but what's even weirder is there's the third party that crops up, the People's Party, or the Populists. They were a group that appealed, and their voter base were farmers, poor Southern whites, and union members. The populists nominate this handsome fellow, James Weaver, to be their president. His vice president, James G. Field. Look at that. No mustachio, no beard. They complement each other. They make like a whole person. Wow. Notice all the symbolism here. Communism symbols. Why? Because the populists are, in essence, socialists. The stuff that they want is socialist. What they stand for is socialist. Pause. Okay, sorry about that brief interruption. So again, going back to the populists. So they were a bizarre mixture of farmers, poor Southern whites, and union members. So they gained a lot of people from the old Greenback Party when the whole buyback compromise kind of killed them off. And a lot of people who were growing more and more towards the belief that the ideas being pushed by a lot of the unions were really good and needed to be adopted. Now, also notice that these three groups of people in particular, okay, farmers living out in the West, specifically the Western states, poor Southern whites, key there is poor Southern whites, union members, they are all not inclined to be in favor of big business or banking. So there are certain things that they're all going to have in common. They supported the idea of silver to back up the currency. They wanted a bimetallic standard, both gold and silver, like the greenbacks did. They favored government ownership of railroads, telephones, and telegraphs, which is a very socialist idea that these means of communication and transportation should be controlled and regulated by the government. No big banks. That's a shot at J.P. Morgan and his kind. Break up the big banks, little local banks only. This one is hard for you guys because all of us, myself included, grew up with the way that it is now. But 150 years ago, people did not elect senators. Senators were chosen by their states. Remember, the idea was that the representatives were for the people, the senators were for the states, and the executive branch was the whole country. So they wanted direct election of senators by the people. Um, in hindsight, this is maybe one of the three worst amendments ever passed to the Constitution. But nevertheless, I digress and jump ahead of myself. They wanted the 8-hour workday. There's the influence of the unions, and they wanted the breakup of big businesses going to either cooperatives or to smaller businesses in general. They're not the only third party though, and the definition of a third party, by the way, is simply any party that is not one of the two big ones, Republican or Democrat. Okay, there's the American Socialists because apparently the populists weren't socialist enough for some people, and the Prohibition Party, and their real agenda was outlawing alcohol. Now, there's three basic issues that govern the election. The difference on tariffs. The Republicans want high protective tariffs. The Democrats and the populists want low tariffs. Why? Because low tariffs will make things cheap. And that's what these people wanted, was cheap goods. For the Democrats, it's an issue of free markets. The Republicans, high tariffs would guard big business. That's where their support comes from. The gold standard. Republicans and Democrats, yes. But, why do I say but? Because both parties have a significant minority in them that are okay with the idea of silver. That's the reason why the Sherman Silver Act got passed. The populists, however, no on the gold standard. Black voting rights. Now, this is an interesting one. Republicans, yes. Democrats, Northern Democrats, yes. Southern Democrats, no. Big surprise, KKK there. Populists, no. Why? Because farmers in the West, poor Southern whites, and unions thought blacks were competition. For farmers, it was competition for land and competition for selling their products. For the poor Southerners, it was just competition in general because they didn't have anything and blacks were competing for that same little bit of anything that was there. For unions, blacks were seen as a way that businesses could cut wages and thereby make money for themselves at the expense of workers. So these three groups were opposed to blacks getting the vote. Now, the election is kind of weird in its own way. It's quiet and respectful. Nobody pulling out baby daddies, nobody yelling about corruption, nobody accusing anybody else of bad things. It was all very polite and gentlemanly. Cleveland's vice president opposed him. So he would give up and give speeches about why you should vote Democrat, but he'd openly say, I don't agree with Cleveland. That's kind of weird when your own vice president doesn't agree with you. Harrison didn't want to run. Many of his own party didn't really want him to run. And quite frankly, he was running like he really didn't want to win. Newsflash, he ain't going to win. The Democrats were actually not able to get on the ballot in 4 Western states. And this is important to understand here because Western, that's the area where the populist farmers were. Those 4 states that they were on the ballot on, not on the ballot on out west, all went populist. And the populists won all of them. Additionally, the populists actually won the state of Louisiana. It was only the Ku Klux Klan preventing them from getting the votes that actually made the Democrats win in that state. Remember, many white Southerners, poor white Southerners, may be Klan members, but they're not the ones who run the Klan. The upper echelon, the elite members of the Klan, the bosses of the Klan, are all rich white Southerners. They want Democrat, not populist. Wyoming, one of the 4 states that didn't have Democrats on the ballot, allows women to vote. Those women vote populist. Maybe the weirdest thing out of all of this is Harrison's wife dies in like September of 1892. And out of respect for Harrison's grieving, everybody stops campaigning. You would not find that today. There would be all sorts of accusations about did Harrison kill his wife as a campaign measure? Did she commit suicide? Was there some kind of conspiracy? Did the Russians do it? Was there a nuclear weapon? Who knows? Any number of weird things. In the end, the outcome of the election is pretty straightforward. Cleveland wins huge by over 400,000 votes. He easily wins the Electoral College, and that's even with 4 states not having the Democrats on the ballot. That's how bad Harrison was and how much he really didn't really want to win anyways. The real big takeaway from this election, though, it doesn't really have to do with who wins. It has to do with this here. It has to do with those populists and their 22 Electoral College votes that should have been higher because of the KKK in the South taking votes away from them. It shows the Democrats and the Republicans that there is something appealing about the populists. And they have to decide what they're going to do. For the Democrats, it's very simple. We are now going to go populist. The Democrats drift to the political left. Cleveland is the last real conservative Democrat elected to office. The closest you're going to get to a conservative Democrat after Grover Cleveland would be John F. Kennedy in 1960. That's like literally 70 years later. And maybe you could argue Harry Truman back in the 40s, early 50s, but late 40s. But still not as conservative as Cleveland was. Excuse me, should have stopped that one. Okay. That's the end of this section. Tomorrow we'll talk about Cleveland's second term and the train wreck that is, unfortunately for him. Not all of it's his fault. Okay. Thanks a lot, guys. Peace and love.